You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 387 of the podcast. And in this one, I got back on Emily Hemendinger. Emily is Clinical Director of the OCD Program at the University of Colorado Health Outpatient Psychiatry Clinic. We discuss what's new with her, what is executive functioning, how OCD can affect executive functioning, how impaired executive functioning can impact people's quality of life, things that can help, decision making, how exposure and response prevention therapy comes into play with decision making, acceptance and commitment therapy, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. This podcast episode is available as a video recording on our Patreon. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to you guys for listening. As always, it means a lot to me. And of course, thank you to Emily for her time. It was nice to chat with her again. Welcome back to the show, Emily.
Hi, so glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you back on. So I guess we did just touch base just now, but I guess for the listeners, I guess professionally, what's been new for you? What have you been up to in your career since we last spoke?
Yeah, so since we last spoke in 2021, our program at the University of Colorado Anschutz, we've grown as a team. We have a couple more members. I officially got the title promotion to clinical director.
Nice.
Of our program. We've taken on fellows and interns and done community trainings. We spoke at the IOCDF conference. We are starting an intensive outpatient in the fall. We're basically doing a whole bunch of things, and I'm doing all the things, like everything, everywhere, all at once is how I feel a lot of times.
Yeah.
With my position, we're doing this really cool fundraiser in the fall, actually called Exposure Palooza, which is going to be like a spooky carnival ERP themed event where we're doing exposures and educating the community and family members and clinicians and people with OCD about OCD. And we're going to have our medical director, Dr. Rachel Davis, Dr. Moksha Patel speak about his experience, and then Reverend Katie O'Dunn speak as well. I'm really excited for it.
That does sound good. Good. And I mean, congrats on the promotion.
Thanks.
No worries. And I might have asked you this before we've run the podcast or like off air. How do people come to see or come to work with you or get therapy at your practice? Do they have to be students of the University of Colorado?
No. So they can be. So our program actually initially started because since we're on a medical campus, the students and residents tend to be more anxious and perfectionistic, and also some have OCD. And so because medical schools and medical campuses tend to have very high achieving, highly anxious people, that's part of the reason why we started the program on that campus, so that we can take students and residents, but we also take community members all in Colorado. Unfortunately, we're still just Colorado for now, but we do virtual and in person. So we can go all over Colorado, including people who are like 6 hours away from us, which is really awesome.
Yeah, that is cool. All right, good. So anyone in Colorado, there you go. We're going to talk about executive functioning and decision making today. Let's start with executive functioning. So I guess broadly, what is executive functioning?
Yeah. So executive functioning is everyone's ability to plan, organize, focus on tasks. It's responsible for controlling impulses and managing stress levels. It's things like decision making, cognitive flexibility, which I talked about last time, memory, time management, and prioritization, our abilities, like I said, to plan and organize, focus, and emotional regulation is the other piece too. So it's something that everyone has varying levels of how our executive functioning is. Depends on a number of different factors, and OCD can definitely impact executive function.
Yeah, good point. So how does OCD impair executive functioning? What are some ways it kind of gets in the way?
Yeah, and so executive functioning, before I even say that, I want to say that executive functioning is also something that we see is impacted by other sort of neurodiverse conditions such as autism or ADHD. And that's why OCD can kind of be even considered neurodiverse, because it really does impact this executive functioning in similar ways. It impacts the way the brain functions. And there is a lot of research actually on this and on how executive functioning is impacted by OCD. So I'm not just like making this up. This is based on research, as well as like my clinical experience with my clients. So OCD, like I talked about last time, OCD impacts cognitive flexibility. So our ability to set shifts, move between different tasks, leave things unfinished, stopping and starting things, being interrupted, and being able to refocus. People with OCD tend to have low cognitive flexibility. They tend to be more rigid. They might have issues being overly focused on details or overly inclusive on details. So a lot of times you might notice yourself or see someone who has OCD, that need for like completeness and need to be fully understood or fully explain something for fear of harming someone or being misunderstood or not feeling complete upon finishing talking. Like they're driven to over explain. It can be really hard to interrupt someone sometimes. Someone with lower cognitive flexibility, like I said, difficulty moving from task to task. It's similar to being like very detail oriented. So they might have issues seeing the bigger picture, getting lost in the trees instead of looking at the whole forest. That sort of deal. Someone with OCD, their executive functioning, they might have difficulty with attention due to being overly focused on threats or things that might go wrong, things that have gone wrong. The OCD brain is really good at recognizing those things. People might have difficulty planning and prioritizing, time management, difficulty filtering out irrelevant data while they're talking or when they're processing something. They might have difficulty filtering out obsessions, and that's why their mind can feel overly busy, is a lot of times what I hear. Difficulty with working memory. So like working memory helps us sustain attention. It helps us in school and work, and it's temporary storage, and it's actually really important in decision making and reasoning. So the difficulty with working memory is part of the reason there's so much doubt that comes up with people who have OCD, right? So OCD is like the doubting disorder. And part of that is because there's difficulty with working memory. Just a few other things. With executive functioning, people with OCD might struggle with procrastination, whether that's due to perfectionism, stuckness, or leaving things unfinished. They might have some cognitive deficits on visual memory tasks. That's what the research shows. And then ultimately a lot of difficulty with making decisions or being indecisive. So that was a lot of information, but those are all the ways that executive functioning can be impacted by OCD. I find that when I share this information with people, like I'll talk about this in my groups too, and people often feel really validated by it. Like, oh, that's why. It's not because I'm a terrible person or a terrible student. Like, this actually really fits, and this makes so much sense. Type deal.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that about the validating, and I loved all the illustration there. I think what comes to my mind is a lot of people listening. Well, if our executive functioning is impaired in some way, it's going to affect our ability to keep jobs, get jobs, hold them down, be able to focus in studying and relationships and all of this stuff. So I guess, to validate that if someone is experiencing all those things because of OCD and because of that impairment, it's normal within OCD, right? There's nothing abnormal about them. It's part of the unfortunate process. And it always reminds me of when I was a kid. Now I've got 3 master's degrees, obviously an undergrad degree, and I'm not bragging about that because I had to change.
You should brag about
Thank
it.
you. I had to change careers. So 2 of those were to become a therapist because I had to do a conversion. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is in primary school, elementary school for you guys, I really struggled. I had special needs classes. So that's what they were called at the time. I'm sure there's a more politically correct term now. But anyway, special needs classes, I was seriously behind on reading, maths, all of that stuff. I think I was even held back a year. And in the final year, I caught up, as in I didn't catch up, but they put me so I would graduate and go into high school. Our high school was from the age of 12. So, or middle school for you guys. So, but I was held back a couple of years. So I grew up kind of feeling really stupid. And we can look back and be like, well, maybe something really clicked in my brain and I became really smart all of a sudden and was able to do well at university level. I got my first A when I did my first master's, and I'd never got an A all through school at any point, so how is that possible, right? But it's, when I think about it, it's my executive functioning was just so impaired because of OCD, because I was worrying the whole time, overthinking, couldn't focus, my attention was bad. So I guess, I just wanted to just use that as an example to validate others that, we are at times disadvantaged and held back because of that executive functioning, but equally, it doesn't have to be a death sentence,
Right. That's so true. We learn and we adapt and we get help. And by getting help and working on our OCD, we can actually work and challenge some of the executive functioning things or executive dysfunction that we might be experiencing. I actually have an example too from school. Can I share that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's a little embarrassing because it shows how impairing my OCD was back in the day. And this goes for my identical twin sister too. Sorry, sis. But I'm sharing this. So in like 5th grade, we had to take, like in 2nd and 5th grade, we had to take IQ tests at the school, like for the state of New York or whatever. And in 5th grade, the teacher said to all of us beforehand, okay, when you're filling out the Scantron, like you're filling out those bubbles, you need to fill them out exactly. You cannot have anything outside of the lines. You cannot, like, any erase marks. You can't have any of that. And you need to have them all complete and done, or else like your answers aren't going to count. Now, my sister and I were sitting completely apart from one another. We didn't talk about this. But what happened to both of us was we took that to mean that everything had to be done perfectly, and we could not see the bigger picture of needing to finish that it was more important to actually put answers in. So both of us ended up only filling out about half or less than half of the questions because we were spending so much time trying to perfectly fill in the Scantron bubbles. And we ended up with an IQ of of something that would be considered in like the DSM as an intellectual developmental disorder. And the teachers were like, what is going on? And it was sort of at that moment that my parents were like, oh, something might be going on. Our kids might be anxious. And it was something like that inability to shift and to see that bigger picture that really, like, looking back, oh, that was some real intense rigidity right there. And it didn't, any other test, like I didn't have that issue, but it was because of those instructions and whatnot. And I just thought it was so weird that my sister and I both did it, even though we were not near each other. So anyway.
No, that's a great story. And obviously it's good that your parents figured out something was up pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And the teachers obviously would have known your guys' level of intelligence, right? So when they saw that, they would have been like, something's not right here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So obviously, impulse control is part of executive functioning. And obviously people with ADHD, not everyone, but a lot of them will struggle with impulse control and then with OCD, with impulse control, what came to my mind was, well, when we in ERP, we say, right, we do the exposure and now we want to resist the compulsion. So I wonder if that struggle of impulse control comes in there, whether that affects the ability to resist or ride out a compulsion.
Yeah. Well, I think people with OCD tend to be more, I'm thinking of this from even an over-controlled DBT and RODBT perspective, where like you have over-controlled or under-controlled. So someone with ADHD might fall more in the under-controlled category of being impulsive, and someone with OCD, OCPD might be over-controlled, meaning they have a lot of oh my goodness, the word is just inhibitory control. Like really, they're really inhibited, and they're not going to act on those impulses. But because of that, there's that need to control or get rid of the anxiety or distress, disgust, guilt, etc., shame, with the compulsion. So it's slightly different from that impulsive reaction, but it's similar. It's just more of like an over-controlled type perspective, versus acting in like an impulsive
way. Yeah. And that's obviously a good clarification too, because I don't want people triggered thinking, oh, am I going to be impulsive and act on my obsessions? Which definitely wasn't my question to begin with. It was more around the compulsion. I know you knew that, but just in case,
But maybe they will, maybe they won't, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, who knows? Cool. No, that's useful. So let's before we move on to decision making, anything else you want to say on executive functioning?
I think most times when people hear this, they feel validated and they feel relieved. Other people might have more anxiety, especially if they struggle with memory related fears of not remembering doing something. And I think like it's important to note that is the OCD is going to find anything to try to reinforce this fear, and you don't have to let it use this to reinforce that fear. And just because you have executive functioning issues or executive dysfunction doesn't mean, like you said, it's not a death sentence. Like going to therapy, doing ERP, that's helpful. Getting like an occupational therapist or a coach to help you work on some of these things like time management, stress management, emotional regulation. DBT is really good for this sort of stuff too. Even CBT, all of it can be very helpful. So it's not a death sentence. It's just to help you understand maybe how you're functioning, maybe ways to ask for support or accommodations at work or in school. So it's not a death sentence. It's to help you have awareness around some of your behaviors and how you show up.
Yeah, really good point. And I guess another kind of question on executive functioning. So, with some of my clients, as they might even be housebound, or they might be really struggling to like get a job or do education or do, arguably quote unquote simple household tasks. Obviously not simple for them in that moment, but from the outside view. But as we go through therapy, and I never really think about this in executive functioning, but I guess it makes sense it's almost like it comes back online, that executive functioning, and they can do much more things without having to think about it, without feeling impaired, and like you say, their memory's better or whatever it is, ability to make choices and decisions. And so I guess I just wanted to kind of ask you that to maybe validate what I'm saying, if you see that and if that kind of stacks up.
Yeah, I think it's like it's almost like a domino effect, right? You start to work on the OCD symptoms, and as a result, these other areas improve in someone's life, in their brain, because they're not letting the OCD run their life. They're choosing to do differently and challenge some of the fears, which makes maybe the obsessions less loud in their brain. And so then they're better able to focus and be present in their life instead of all in their head. And so I see that too. I see that, like, even if you just start to work on the OCD, and sometimes the OCD is super entrenched with some executive functioning things like time management, procrastination, like if you have compulsions around checking, that can really get in the way of time management, right? So if you start to work on those things, these other pieces in your life, bigger picture, start to get better.
Yeah, really good point. And as you talk there, what also hits me is when I talk about it to my clients, I talk about it like the upstairs and downstairs brain. Upstairs brain being basically the executive functioning, all the bits that make us a smart human being is in that upstairs brain. And then the downstairs brain is much more it's where the amygdala is, for example. And so when we're really triggered and in that downstairs brain, I kind of sell it as our upstairs brain is not offline, but it's overpowered and it can't think, it can't. So as that downstairs brain calms, I guess maybe that's a way of illustrating executive functioning coming back online. We kind of walk back upstairs and there all our faculties are.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great way of explaining those like different functions of our brain, for sure. Love that.
Yeah. So maybe we haven't lost it. It's just temporarily overpowered,
Yeah, it's like when a system gets overpowered and needs to come back online, it's just like buffering almost, or rebooting.
Yeah. And of course, so in preparation for this interview, I did look at some more on executive functioning. Obviously, I'm familiar with it, but I personally wouldn't want to I wouldn't want to be the guest giving this talk. I don't think I know that much. But with child development, obviously, as babies, we're not born with executive functioning. We have to learn that, right? And I think there's something hopeful in that, of if we can learn it as babies, we can learn it also later on in life.
Oh yeah, our brains are, even though research shows our brains stop like developing when we're 26. That doesn't mean our brains don't learn and don't change. That's sort of like the stopping point for some of those bigger functions, sort of like executive functioning or like impulse control. That's why more young adults are more likely to be impulsive. It's because the brain is still growing and developing. But throughout our life, like, we can keep learning and we can change. Our brains can still be very malleable. It gets harder when we get older, and that does not mean that that's like nothing to do. There are still things you can do to train your brain and work on some of these functions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. It's just like muscles in our body, right? It does get harder as we get older to put on muscle and stuff, but we can still do it. It still happens. It's just maybe a bit more work is needed than when we're 18, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. But good point on teens, actually, about they can be very risky and take risky behaviors. And that's just where their brain is at in the developmental stage. And there's obviously evolutionary arguments for that too. When we were in tribes and stuff and had to hunt, had to find a mate, had to do all of that stuff. You'd need to risk take to do that. Whereas now we can go on Tinder and it's less risk. And well, there's still some risk on Tinder.
Yeah. The risk is there's some bigger risk, but mostly the risk is like going on a bad date.
Exactly.
But then you have a good story, right?
That's true. Yeah. Good point. So decision making. How would you want to set up decision making before we jump into it?
I mean, I think it's one part of executive functioning, and it's a part that I see so strongly affected by OCD, anxiety in general, but OCD especially. I know I have struggled with decision making, and have had to really actively work on it, in a number of different ways. So we could set it up as like just one specific part of executive functioning that is seen to be impacted by OCD and that you can do ERP around.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, and I see this a lot with I mean, I work with children and teens, so especially with the teens, decision making can be a bit shaky anyway sometimes, or sometimes it can be impulsive. But yeah, generally from what I understand from the podcast and working with adults and decision making can be tough at times because there's a lot of risk from the OCD side of things, right? Well, what happens if I do this and that's the wrong thing, or that leads me into this fear that I'm worried about, or XYZ. How do you, using ERP or anything like that, get them to start just making choices, making decisions?
Yeah. With ERP, I think I work with them. I mean, there are some specific ERP things you can do, but I think I talk to them about with decision making, there's always going to be uncertainty because we're not going to know how something turns out. We can't predict the future. We can't read somebody's mind. And if we make the wrong decision, it's really not going to be the wrong decision. Like life is going to go on anyway, just like with any sort of feared consequence with ERP is OCD makes us think that if this thing happens, our life is over. I can't handle it. I'm overwhelmed. That's it. And the truth is life goes on. It's going to absolutely suck. And it's going to be devastating or humiliating or, fill in the blank, and life goes on. So regardless of what decision we make, life goes on. And it's all about like, how are you going to live a values-based life, even if this thing happens, even if you make the wrong decision, type deal.
Yeah, really good point. I guess you're familiar with Dr. Phillipson, Stephen Phillipson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's talked on the podcast before about just making choices. I don't think he linked it to executive functioning, or maybe he did. I can't remember. But this just make a choice, right or wrong. Just make, and sometimes this is what I find hard to get through to my clients. So we're just practicing making choices, and even if it's the wrong choice, whatever that means, you'll learn from it. And over time, you'll become so good at making choices that you'll rarely make a choice that's not that great, Right. Maybe I'm wrong there. That's my prediction.
No, it's true though. And I think I like to frame it too is regardless of what decision you make, the decision you don't make is always going to seem better because it's fantasy. It's not real life. It doesn't have all the messiness of real life. I like to illustrate it oftentimes with like relationship OCD of you know, the partner you don't choose is always going to seem better because that's like fantasy romance novel type partner. And the partner you have is real life, which real life relationships are messy and not perfect. And of course, the choice you don't pick is going to seem better because it's not reality.
Yeah, and that fantasy pick doesn't have bodily function. You know, he or she isn't burping, farting, like,
it's,
you know, annoying you. Like, yeah. I'm glad you said relationship OCD because before you said it was exactly what popped into my head.
Right.
Because you see it a lot of like, hey, man, I should have picked him or her and wonder what my life would have been like with him or her. Or it's really hard to compare the fantasy to reality.
Yeah. That's where I see the indecision so much with relationship OCD, even with just like dating and like dating apps, you know, like you have so many choices and some of that, it's like FOMO, almost like this fear of missing out of, well, what if I go on a date with this person and I miss out on this person? And it's all this overthinking and it's like, no, you just need to make a decision. Make a choice because regardless, your brain is probably going to romanticize this other choice you didn't make.
Yeah, good point. I don't know, the analogy, I think it's an analogy came to me of like, it's like going to a restaurant with all the best dishes in the world in this restaurant, and you can pick any one. It's like, how do you pick one, you know? And it's like on Tinder, how do you pick one? You know, it's yeah. At some point you need to.
Otherwise you're stuck and
yeah.
It's either like the decision's made for you, which is not a way to be empowered and not to like take charge of our life, or like you miss out on something and that's almost worse.
That's true. Yeah. Making a decision has a cost and not making a decision has a cost.
Right.
You got to decide which is worse. Probably not making a decision is not always. I'm sure there's occasions when it's probably good not to make a decision.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. It's like sometimes it's good to sleep on it. Sometimes but as long as you're making the decision to not make the decision,
good point. That is a decision. Yeah. True. Yeah, very good point. So with decision making or any part of executive functioning, how do we tie it into ERP or get ERP involved, or any ideas like that?
So I sort of have two ways of thinking about it. So you can think of decision making, you can think of the exposure as being actually making the decision. And then the response prevention is owning the decision, meaning you're not acting on compulsions around the decision. So like you're not reassurance seeking, you're not confessing, you're not mentally reviewing, you're not going back and changing your mind, especially several times, and you're not avoiding. And so if there are people who struggle with letting go of control, like they need to make all the decisions, they can't, or they need to do all the things, very perfectionistic, very much like I am right and no one else makes the decision, no one else can do these jobs for me. So if you struggle with letting go of control, the ERP looks like trying to have someone make a decision for you. So, for example, having a coworker pick out your lunch for the day, or having your partner pick out your outfit. This is not me giving permission to our indecisive folks to do this. We'll get to that in a second, but this is specifically for people who struggle with being over controlled and have rigidity around letting go of things. So like something else someone could do is delegate. Delegating is so difficult for people who are perfectionistic, and who have trouble letting go of control. So delegating is something that I have a lot of my clients do. So like doing an exposure where you pick at least 3 things from your most likely very, 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 very long to-do list and ask for help with them or assign them to someone else. So for example, If you're throwing a party and you have a really long to-do list of cleaning, picking up the food, decorating, etc., before the party gets started, ask a friend to pick up the pizza or ask another friend to come early to help set up decorations, because you don't have to do everything by yourself and it doesn't need to be perfect. And asking for help or delegating actually promotes connection and vulnerability.
Mm.
It's admitting that like we aren't perfect, and it lets the other person know that you trust them with something important, and therefore brings them closer to you and closer to one another. So that's for people who are over controlled. I can go more into like other decision-making ERP if that would be helpful.
Well,
too.
yeah. And obviously the over control would also be good for OCPD, right?
Yep. Especially, yes. Those are some like really good behavioral experiments for OCPD to try to do exposures around and test some of that desire to be in control and perfectionistic.
Yeah.
So, on another note, if you struggle just in general making decisions, some sort of tips or ERP things you can practice are making smaller decisions. So sometimes I want to validate that for some, any decision is overwhelming and produces a long barrage of like intrusive thoughts and anxiety. So you could even start by making like a hierarchy around decision-making exposures, because overall, like not all decisions feel equal. So for instance, if it's hard to make a decision about where you and your partner are going to go out to eat, like maybe that's a lower level one. Because really, is that on the same level of trying to decide whether or not you want to stay at your current job? Like, not really. So make a hierarchy of decision-making exposures and start with the ones that are smallest or a little distressing. So maybe instead of answering the question of what do you want to eat or what do you want to do, instead of answering, I don't know, or whatever you want, you could answer with, I'm actually in the mood for Thai food, or I'd like to watch this movie. I'd like to watch an episode of The Office. Like being more assertive and practicing that assertiveness in smaller decisions. Other sorts of things could be setting time limits for making choices. So if you are trying to buy a new laptop, and you are the type of person that compulsively researches and needs to click on every single page of a website to look at every single option, you spend hours, days, weeks trying to find the right one, give yourself a day to decide. Or instead of scrolling through every single page of clothing items, challenge yourself to only go through the first 4 pages and make a decision. Sitting with the discomfort that maybe there was something you would have liked better on the other pages. And so there's that response prevention piece. You can do scripting around worst case scenario, making the wrong decision or having to live with the consequences of the wrong decision. And then if you give yourself a time frame to make the decision in, I actually found out about this app from, I think it was a presentation that John Hirschfield did, but you set a time frame to make a decision by, and if the time frame passes and you still haven't made the decision, you use an app like Roundum, Roundum, to decide for you. So you put the choices in and it's like a randomizer and it just makes the decision for you. You kind of give it up to the universe and random computer AI type stuff to make the decision. You can add a super random third choice and have that decision made for you, and then own that decision and the consequences of having this app make the decision for you.
Yeah. Some really good ideas. And I think with the picking the dinner option of like, let me pick Thai food, for example. You know, if you make the choice, you pick Thai food, and you know what? It's not great because it hasn't hit the spot. Actually, what you really craved was pizza. And if you had more time, you would have picked pizza, whatever it is. You're obviously going to be a bit bummed it hasn't quite hit the spot. But equally, I think in those moments, take pride. I made a choice, it was maybe not the best choice, but I'm really proud that I did it. And then obviously that's going to positive feedback loop and make you more likely to want to pick again. Whereas if you don't do that and you're like, why did I pick Thai food? I don't like Thai food. And you're not going to want to make a choice again on picking a meal.
Right. And it's that concept that life goes on and life will continue regardless of the choice that you made. And are you going to spend your time? It's that, the ACT concept. Are you going to spend your time beating yourself up, or are you going to accept your decision and do something that's in line with your values? Is beating yourself up really in line with your values, or is continuing to go on with your day more in line with that big picture, your values and the life you want?
Yeah, really good point. I'm glad you mentioned ACT, because
Always.
ACT is all about psychological flexibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which makes me feel like it's somewhat of a solution to this what we're talking about here. So just anything you want to say about that?
I mean, I say always because I always bring it back to ACT. My background's very strongly ACT based, and I love it. And I think it really can help with some of this decision-making piece. Obviously, OCD is going to be like, well, do I really know what my values are? And what if it's this value, or what if it's that value? Because OCD when you have OCD, you can overthink anything.
Yes.
And if you're really identifying like what your true values are and what that bigger picture is, not the details of which value is the right value, you're looking at the big picture of who's the person I want to be. Like, I always think of the 80th birthday exercise, or I think other people use obituary, but it's like, what do you want people to be saying at your 80th birthday about you? Do you want them to be talking about how you made all the right decisions, or do you want them to be talking about how compassionate you were and the things that you accomplished and how great of a partner you were? So really zooming out and seeing that big picture. That's why I think ACT is so good with challenging some of that rigidity and detail, like overly focused on detail piece of OCD.
Yeah, really, really good point. All right, nice. Is there anything you wanted to add to decision making before we move on?
I think I said the values piece. I think radical acceptance is always a good tool, and self-compassion with recognizing that like you're human and humans don't always make, the perfect choice, because there's no such thing. But radical acceptance, accepting instead of fighting and struggling against our choices and what life throws at us. Radical acceptance with decision making means owning the decisions and approaching situations instead of avoiding them, being proactive even. So the overall, like the truth is that the decision you don't make, like I said before, is always going to seem better because it's not based in reality. So it's better to make the decision yourself than have life make the decision for you.
Yeah, really, really, really good point. So last time I asked you to pick up the phone and call your 20-year-old self. This time I want you to pick up the phone and call your 10-year-old self.
Oh boy. Okay. What would I say to them?
Yeah. What did they need to hear?
They needed to hear probably one, take up space. Don't try to make yourself smaller, take up space. And that to breathe, I think. Breathe, it will be okay. And if it's not, life goes on. Those are the big three things I think that my 10-year-old self would need to hear.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, good, cool. Would she have listened?
I feel like she probably would have listened more than my 20-year-old self.
Yeah.
But yeah, she probably would have listened.
Yeah. Well, again, we can go back to how the brain develops. 20-year-old, you're just leaving that adolescence. So it might still be a bit, was 10-year-old you, the brain
rebellious.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, cool. And in Colorado, you've got a billboard. What do you want written on it?
I'm gonna again go with take up space. That's my most recent mantra to myself, and to a lot of my clients, especially if there's a co-occurring eating disorder going on. I think we all gotta take up space. We need to celebrate ourselves and what we're doing, and not be afraid to, like, maybe we'll be a burden on someone, maybe we won't, but we need to get our needs met and we need to take up space. So taking up space. I have this cool
nice sticker. No one else can see but us. Apart from Patreon, they can see. Yeah, cool. Did you design that or did you find it somewhere?
No, I found that. But it's similar to something that I had my friend design for my office. Because like I said, it's my most recent mantra to myself, and I find that it keeps coming up in sessions too, and that's why I've taken it on myself too.
Nice. I like that. And then lastly, anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
I don't think so. I think that was everything. I love talking about this stuff, and I love talking with you. So I'm glad we got to do this again.
Yeah, likewise. It's a real pleasure to have you on again. And I'm glad I could finally cover executive functioning. I'm sure it'll give some relief to many people.
Oh, yes.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. And if you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theOCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.